What we are covering this term is the story of God. And as we do, this week is an introduction, but we would like to look at the way in which we approach the nature of God and our faith in God. We live based on things we cannot prove, but about which we are certain. Now, this is true in every area of life. In fact, Euclid, back whenever he was establishing the study of geometry, began with axioms. And these are things that are just simply known, things that are obvious, but they can't be proven. For example, that the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. Now, but how do you prove that? How can you, using logic, set logic proof? It's just intuitive. It's an axiom. And he came up with a handful of axioms from which everything else could be proven. And in a very real way, faith in God is axiomatic. We spend sometimes a lot of effort in proving the existence of God. And yet, in a very real sense, there's a difficulty in that. How do you prove someone who is ultimate? Blaise Pascal wrote, "The heart has its reasons which reason does not know." There are things that are just simply innate in people. And whenever we begin looking at the existence of God, we have to recognize that the Creator does not submit to our judgment as to his existence. Have you ever thought about how arrogant it is for me to say, okay, God, prove you exist? Of course, someone who would do such a thing probably wouldn't want the answer that would come back to them. The Creator does not submit to our judgment as to his existence, but there is within us understanding. All people everywhere understand the existence of God. Now, that doesn't mean that they all believe in God, but it is one of these things where no matter where you go throughout the entire world, throughout all of human history, if you began talking about the divine, about the gods or a God, no one would look at you and say, I've never heard of such a thing. Now, there have always been those who didn't believe. Now, in some cultures, that's very, very rare. But all people at least know the concept. They know the idea that there is a God. And that should tell us something. The Apostle Paul on Mars Hill discussed this ubiquitous understanding of God, that God is known. Picking up in Acts 17, verse 22. So Paul, standing in the midst of the Areopagus, said, "Men of Athens, I perceive that in every way you are very religious. For as I passed along and observed the object of your worship, I found also an altar with this inscription, to the unknown God. What therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by man, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gave to all mankind life and breath and everything. And he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling place, that they should seek God and perhaps feel their way toward him and find him. Yet he is actually not far from each one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being, even as some of your poets have said, for we are indeed his offspring. Now, whenever we begin looking at this concept that God is everywhere, and people, no matter what their status, at least know the category, they know about God. And so the question is, what do they do with that knowledge? Belief in the spiritual realm commends itself to us innately. By definition, you cannot, in a tactile way, reach out and feel the spiritual world. You're not going to look with your physical eyes and see it, but we innately find it commended to us. Humanity's ongoing attempt to feel their way towards God can be seen in so many ways. The Apostle Paul referenced this. Augustine said, understanding is the reward of faith. Therefore, seek not to understand that you may believe, but believe that you may understand. Without faith in God, without faith in the spiritual world, there are so many things you cannot explain. Things that you posit in your day-to-day life. The idea that human beings have value, that human beings have dignity, that there are things that are right as opposed to things that are wrong. The entire realm, as we'll see in a moment, of aesthetics, that there's such a thing as beauty, things that are lovely. And we look at all of this, and if you don't have a spiritual realm, what sense does any of that make? Now, from time to time, non-believers have tried to be consistent. B.F. Skinner, for example, Harvard psychologist, taught that we were just simply biochemical machines, that it was all conditioning. And he worked out the logical conclusions of that, and he published a book called Beyond Freedom and Dignity, because he taught that there is no such thing as freedom. There is no such thing as human dignity. Now, this isn't some crackpot. This was one of the most prestigious psychologists at Harvard in the 20th century. Or philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre, who put forward very clearly that man had to invent man. What he meant by that was all these values we have, we just make them up on the fly. And there's no reason to say this value is better than that value. But Augustine tells us, if you believe, then you can understand. In humanity's ongoing effort to feel their way toward the divine, certain ideas have emerged that commend themselves to the human soul, but which cannot be explained apart from a spiritual reality. And it's intriguing. You go back, the mathematician, philosopher Leibniz, brilliant man. In fact, independent of Isaac Newton, he discovered calculus. There was some question for a few years. No one knew who discovered calculus first. Newton beat him out by a few months. But independent of Newton, he discovered calculus. He was a brilliant man. And he became fascinated with the truth that whether you're studying the ancient Roman philosophers or you're studying Mohammedanism or Christianity, no matter who you're studying, there are certain ideas that float to the surface. And it's not because of cross-pollination. It's human beings continually feel these things. Leibniz called it the perennial philosophy. And that's a term that will be brought up over and again in the study of this. Whenever we look at this, we find in American history, the transcendentalists like Emerson were very involved in trying to distill what are the essential points that everyone understands intuitively. Mid 20th century, Aldous Huxley, the author of Brave New World, published a volume entitled The Perennial Philosophy. And he went through and he categorized those things that he contended every culture put forward. A belief in a divine being, the idea of needing to be reverent, the idea of respecting life, of having a degree of honesty and morality. It's interesting when you look at this. The presuppositions of a spiritual reality are an essential framework for those things that make us fully human. So, whenever you talk about, as we used to in school, the humanities, the study of the humanities has fallen on hard time. And I do contend, by the way, that part of the trouble that we have in our culture is that we've lost track of what it really means to be human. You develop as a person studying great works of literature, studying poetry, studying music in a way that you cannot develop just studying the empirical sciences. The presuppositions of a spiritual reality are essential in this study. C.S. Lewis identified this, and if you were just going to read one book on this concept of the perennial philosophy, C.S. Lewis's book, The Abolition of Man, is the one I would recommend. By the way, starting this fall, we're going to have a reading series where once or twice a month, we're going to be taking a great work of literature and going through it in an intensive way, showing the Christian value of it. We're going to be starting this study with the book, The Abolition of Man. Now, in this book, Lewis takes the idea of aesthetics as a starting point, the idea of the beautiful, the magnificent. And he lays out that if you don't have an appreciation for that spiritual reality, that you're going to end up being no more than an animal, because that's what you're really saying about people. If you don't believe men and women have souls, if you don't believe what it means to be human, then what are people? Now we look at this, and at the end of this book, at the end of The Abolition of Man, Lewis identifies, and he uses the term the Tao. Some people pronounce it Tao, but it's pronounced Tao. And it just simply is the Chinese word for the way. And he goes through and he provides, drawn from the Greco-Roman philosophers, drawn from Asian philosophy, drawn from a wide range of things, including scripture, what he calls the way. And these are all things that we would think of as basic humanity. The command to be kind, to be giving, to be charitable. And these things are important. The idea of aesthetics provides for us recurring themes that emerge as men and women work their craft in all the varieties of literature, visual arts, and the performing arts. These themes can only be understood in the context of a spiritual reality. You look at this, and the entire question of why is it that great literature speaks to you and speaks across time to different people in different parts of the world. And the reason is, even with our differing backgrounds, we share a common humanity. And so while you read a story of someone overcoming an obstacle, you don't necessarily have, you may not have done that exact same thing. You know, you've never been given a ring of power that you need to destroy But you can read Lord of the Rings and you can understand someone who has a quest, someone who has something that he needs to do, that he ought to do, and it resonates with you. And so it is that this is an indication of our spiritual reality. Again, from C.S. Lewis, this is from his book, Mere Christianity. He writes, if we find ourselves with a desire that nothing in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that we were made for another world. And so it is when you begin looking at the aspirations that people have. The reason why, when people read about the hero on his quest, that they feel ennobled, that they feel lifted up, it's an indication that we were made for better things. A spiritual worldview provides a framework for understanding the world in which we live and is the framework that underlies the stories we tell ourselves and others about our experiences. Now we look at this. Why is it that stories are so important? They are important because they resonate with us. They reach us. And bear in mind, God has primarily communicated to us in stories. You look at the Bible, and most of the Bible is history. Most of the Bible is narrative. Proportionally, very little is what you would think of as didactic teaching. And certainly the epistles and sections of the Pentateuch are, but most of it, God tells the story of his people, and sometimes they do good things and they serve as an example of what you ought to do, and sometimes they don't do good things. In fact, most of the examples in Scripture are what you ought not to do. But they resonate with us. Now, stories that we share can be works of pure fiction, or they can be recounting of actual events in whole or in part. I do not want you to miss this. Just because something is a story does not mean it didn't happen. When I was doing graduate work in journalism over at Ohio State, I served for a term as the religion reporter for the Ohio State Lantern, of all things. And you know what? Whenever we did reporting, we talked about filing our stories, because the story is important. It's what you're presenting that resonates with other people. And for that reason, we should consider the nature and study of history. The Germans in the 1800s divided the study of history into two things, and these are the terms they use. One is Historie, which sounds like our word history. And what that means is just what happened. So if you were to set up a camera and focus it on Fishinger Road, and you watched cars going back and forth, at an end of a period of time, you could say between this time and that time, here are how many cars came through. Now, you don't say anything about what that means. You don't provide any kind of framework. You just say, there it is. As opposed to that, their word Geschichte. And if you ever do much in religious studies, you'll find that this is the term that's normally used for the biblical history. It is history that provides an interpretation. It's true, but it is artistically arranged. It's presented in a way that has a beginning, a middle, and an end. It's presented in a way that selects materials in order to commend some lesson to the reader. That doesn't mean it's not true, but it means that it has a power that will resonate and will change our lives. In the course of this, we are concerned with the moral of the story. Now, all works of art have a moral. All do. Sometimes it's very blatant what that story, what that moral is. The fabulous, whether you're talking about Aesop's fables or Fontaine's fables, they would have a little story and then they would end with, and the moral of the story is. Now, this idea of the moral is the idea of the spirit of the story, the heart of it. The moral of the story is the archetypical lesson moving from what happened in the story to what always happens in life. So, for example, if you read a biography of George Washington, you should be able to read that and not just say, here is what happened, but look at it and say, okay, from his life, we can see a man who had conflicting values. Washington agonized over freeing his slaves, for example. That weighed on him. Well, there is a lesson that we can draw from that as we struggle with consistency in our lives. He was a man who had a profound humility. He did not jockey for prestige and position. It was thrust upon him. And he's a man who was willing to relinquish power rather than becoming a king. There are a lot of lessons you can draw, but that moral is not just what Washington did, but rather, what can I learn from that? C.S. Lewis makes an application of this in an essay that he wrote on myth becomes fact. You look at what a myth is, and we think in terms of myth as a fabrication. But Lewis, being an Oxford English professor, used myth in the technical term of a story. And he put forward that the truth of the biblical narrative was in no way less true because it is a great story. Now we look at this and why should this be? And Lewis put forward that the great story of Scripture resonates with us because we are made in the image of God. And he says, because of that, it should not surprise us that most world religions have a resurrection story. Think in terms of Norse mythology, the resurrection of Balder. And yet, you look at this, it's not that the resurrection story we find in the New Testament is somehow just a recrafting of these fairy tales, but rather that there is something in our humanity that longs for that new birth, that longs for that resurrection, and that the real event that happened is a confirmation that that longing is a legitimate thing. We look at this, we'll see that the task of our study, as we will proceed through our course, is to remain true to the facts and yet to look for the eternal meaning of the story, the moral. The term moral is drawn from the Latin more, which just simply means a habitual way of proceeding. Now, we use moral in terms of virtue, someone who's a moral person as opposed to being immoral. But the word moral at its root means that which is spiritual. And we use it in that way too. We talk about a moral victory. Well, that does not necessarily mean it was a victory of virtue. It means it's a victory that in your heart you feel good about. Or if somebody is with you for moral support, well, that doesn't mean that they are there to keep you from doing something that's wrong. It means they are there to strengthen your spirit. And so it is the moral, the eternal meaning of the story is what will resonate in our spirit. Now, we're going to be proceeding through, starting next week, the narrative of Scripture, and we're going to be unfolding the story of God. And it is recognizing that in Scripture, God is a major figure. Sometimes we relegate him to being a bit part in the story. And we tell the story about David, for example, and we talk about David's great exploits and all the things that he did, and then we'll reference, and he prayed to God. Well, God's there, but we're not looking primarily at him. The course of our study, remaining true to the facts, we'll be looking for the eternal things that we can learn about God. We're going to begin looking at the God who is infinite and personal as he reveals himself in the opening sections of Scripture. We're going to proceed with how he has revealed himself to his people as the Redeemer. It's kind of amazing. One of the first things we learn about God is that he doesn't always punish sin immediately. Think about that. That's a tremendous story about God, telling you about his character. When I'm gone to camp, Daniel is going to fill in for me and look at the God of infinite wisdom. But we'll proceed and we will see the way in which God has revealed himself. And in doing this, learn more about him, but then also learn more about what it means to be human, to be a man or woman made in the image of God. This will be our story of God as we go through this quarter. I'm looking forward to proceeding with this, and I thank you for being part of the class.